My name is Teniola Tayo, currently the Trade Policy Fellow with the Africa Policy Research Institute. And I'll be having an expert interview with Axel Berger. So Axel Berger, it was good to run into you some weeks ago at the WTO Public Forum in Geneva. It's great to have you here virtually today to talk about the WTO's investment for development agreement, investment facilitation for development agreement, actually the IFD. So maybe you can introduce yourself now and then just tell us something work-wise that excites you that you're doing at the moment.
Well, thank you very much for reaching out, and it was indeed great to meet you at the forum in Geneva. I'm Deputy Director of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. That's a think tank and research institute based in Bonn, Germany, and we work on various issues related to development and global development, developing countries. And what excites me at the moment is just to observe the ongoing discussions at the WTO about the reform of the WTO, about the role plurilateral agreements. So, if you like, alliances of the willing, or coalition of the willing, and the role of these plurilateral agreements in pushing forward the reform of the WTO.
Yeah, I think exciting times really, because the world is changing very quickly. So I'm glad that some of these major multilateral institutions are looking to keep up with what's happening in the world. We're going to dive right into it. So the WTO's Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, it would be great if you can tell us what it is, what does it aim to do, what is its current status, and then why we should care about it.
Well, it's the IFD, Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement discussions. This is one of those plurilateral tracks I've just mentioned. So it's a subset of WTO members that come together to discuss and then later on negotiate on a particular issue area, right? We have plurilaterals on investment facilitation, which we will discuss today, but then there's also plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce, service domestic regulations, small and medium-sized enterprises. And what's special about the IFD negotiations is that it's not driven and pushed forward by developed countries, so the OECD countries, but by non-OECD countries, developing countries, large emerging economies, whatever you like to call them. Some call them countries from the global south. And that's special because typically these plurilateral negotiations are pushed forward by these OECD countries. But here we have a group of countries, and they come together as in a group of friends of investment facilitation, FIFID, which are from the global south and which use the WTO to further their interest in a particular area, and that's investment facilitation, obviously. These countries have an interest in attracting FDI, but some of them, the Brazils, the Chinas, they also like to use these negotiations in order to promote their outgoing FDI. And what the agreement is about, well, let's start with focusing on what it's not about. So it's not about the typical issues you find in bilateral investment treaties or investment chapters in free trade agreements. So it's not about market access for foreign investors. It's not about legal protection of foreign investors. It's not about investor-state dispute settlement, an arrangement which have come under severe criticism over the last 1 or 2 decades. And so the investment facilitation for development negotiations and the agreement, which has been concluded in principle just in July, aims at improving domestic investment frameworks by making them more transparent, more predictable, by making them more efficient, by setting up domestic level institutions like single windows for handing in the documents you need in order to register your investment, with focal points that provide information to foreign investors, and all those things, very practical issues. And obviously, the IFD agreement also establishes or aims to establish a committee at the WTO level, which then, can support mutual learning of best practices, sharing of knowledge, and international cooperation on investment matters. What is also very exciting about the IFD agreement, and that's the last point, then I'll mention, I'll stop answering this question. The first question is it has a strong development focus. So the idea is to help developing countries, and in particular the least developed countries, in implementing the agreement, because only if you implement it, you can benefit from it. And so it adopts the needs assessment mechanism, if you like, from the trade facilitation agreement, where you basically conduct domestic level workshops in order to understand, okay, what are the gaps we have when we would like to implement the agreement? What kind of provisions do we already cover, right? Which institutions do we already have, and where do we still have to invest in order to set up institutions, reform laws and regulations, etc., etc. So, and on this basis on the basis of these needs assessments, then donors come in and can help LDCs and developing countries in with technical assistance and capacity building. So this is a very important element of the IFD negotiations, because it's not only about having an international agreement, but also it's even more important to be able to implement it domestically.
Thank you. So from what I'm hearing, it's a very practical instrument. And one of the main objectives is to more or less drive, encourage, and support domestic reform. So internal reform in these countries that will make it easier for investors to set up shop. And linked to perhaps some of the surveys, or a lot of the surveys that have been done with foreign investors asking, why did you choose to locate or not locate in this country, in this economy, and trying to answer some of those questions. I think it's a very key instrument, a very important one. But then I don't know if I caught this. What is the current status of the agreement? You said it's been agreed. So is it being implemented already?
No, it isn't. It's agreed in principle, if you like. I don't know whether that's the official term, but it's actually more than 110 WTO members, so 2/3 of the WTO membership. And they agreed on a text. So I guess we are now in the phase of legal scrubbing and revising the text, on the margins, but the substance is there. How the agreement should look like. And now obviously the members or the participants of the IFD negotiations face two challenges. The first one is conducting outreach, so convincing more countries, and in particular countries, developing countries, LDCs, and in particular from Africa, to join the agreement and become a member and participate in the process, in particular the needs assessment process that I've just mentioned, as a tool to support domestic reforms. And the second challenge beyond outreach is to integrate the agreement into the WTO, which is a highly political process and which is complicated because it needs consensus. So you also need the agreement from those countries who are not participating in the negotiations. On the one hand, you could say, what's the problem, right? Because investment facilitation is about domestic reforms. The agreement works on the basis of MFN, right? So the other parties or the other WTO members, which are not party to the agreement, would also benefit to some extent, not fully, right? That's also what our impact assessments show, that the outsiders will benefit from some spillover effects, but obviously not to the extent members would benefit from the agreement. But still, they are not at a disadvantage. Let's put it that way. But since it's a plurilateral agreement, it involves a highly political process, because there are some certain WTO members. Or one may mention India and South Africa in particular, which are very vocal about plurilaterals, which are very much opposed to using plurilaterals before being able to work on the remaining issues of the Doha development round. And so that's that's where we stand. Outreach plus finding a way to integrate the agreement into the WTO legal architecture, if you like.
Okay. So still some work to be done, but I guess things are moving along very speedily. Now, there's something I want to ask you. While reading about this agreement, I found that it has a particular focus on sustainable investment. And I think this is a reflection of the broader trend, the global trend towards sustainability, renewable energy investment, energy transition, but just recognizing the climate crisis and the fact that everything we do now, even as a society, has to be geared towards, being sustainable. Can you comment a bit on this focus on sustainability and what it really means for the agreement, especially when it's being implemented?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, the agreement facilitates all investments. Yeah, so not only investments in sectors, in areas which are particularly important with regard to sustainability or the green economy, if you like. So that's more an issue of investment promotion. Yeah, so having a domestic level investment promotion agency which tries to attract certain kinds of investors, which are working on certain certain criteria, ESG criteria, if you like, or channeling them to certain sectors. So that's not what the IFD agreement is about, because it's about establishing what's special about the IFD agreement is that I think it's basically the first WTO agreement which covers a whole chapter on sustainable development. And here, obviously, it's as I just discussed, it's not about channeling certain types of investments that are, relevant for sustainable development, but it's about incorporating rules on anti-corruption. It's about incorporating international conventions on labor, so a number of ILO conventions, and so by trying to incorporate these international standards in terms of sustainable development into the agreement, it aims at contributing to sustainable development. And as I said, it's also key that the agreement has a development dimension, so that it tries to promote LDCs and developing countries in order to be able to implement.
When a lot of people hear sustainability, they only think about the environment side of things, but then social sustainability is a key aspect. And it's linked to what you said, the fact that it's investment for development, so investment facilitation for development. So it goes back to the question of governance, and then of course of social issues, jobs, employment creation, and what that really means. And I think it's important because like a trend it seems like we've been seeing is the fact that some investments, a lot of FDI now is not as coupled with employment creation as it used to be, because things are changing. So what are the implications of that for LDCs that are really still struggling to solve some of these social issues through, in some ways, attracting capital into the economies? So thank you so much for that. And now from what you've said, like you said, it's focused on LDCs, so non-developed countries. And we know that a number of those are in Africa. And one of the major projects now, something that is very much talked about, is the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The commencement was announced in January 2021. Negotiations are still ongoing, but moving along very speedily. And in fact, there's an interim trading arrangement that was launched last year, which is a guided trade initiative. it will be expanded, or it hopes to be expanded this year to include more countries. The first phase was 8 countries, and then there are some expectations that it will be expanded. And one of the protocols of the AFCFTA, so one of the protocols that has been adopted is the protocol on investment. And I think that there's some, synergies here. So the AFCFTA's investment protocol is very expansive. It really seeks to improve the regulatory environment for investment, similar to what you've described, but also it has a mandate of promoting, facilitating investment, but also protecting investment. So some of the things that the IFD doesn't cover, this protocol covers it. But I feel like now this protocol, I mean, it's been adopted, but then it's still being, similar to the IFD, still being cleaned up, being scrubbed. And then it has to be ratified, I think, by state parties as well for it to become operational. But then there are some similar objectives here from the way I see it. And I think that it will make a lot of sense if there is a way for these 2 instruments to work together, because there will be some resources that will be put behind the WTO's IFD or behind its implementation. And then some resources will be put behind the AFCFTA's investment protocol, so in its implementation. In fact, the investment protocol provides for the creation of a new agency called the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency. So that's going to be an agency with the mandate for doing a lot of these things that you're describing and working alongside all of the different national IPs in Africa. From your point of view, so from where you're sitting, do you have some idea of what may be opportunities for cooperation between the 2 instruments? Because they'll both be backed by resources, and the resources are scarce, wherever you look. So it's important that they're being used efficiently. So what do you think about, and then I said also because the target economies for the 2 instruments are intersecting to an extent.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, both tracks and both negotiation arenas, so to speak, are highly interesting because the IFD agreement pursues an innovative approach, and obviously the AFCFTA process is also if not the most important negotiation track for African economies and African countries. Where those two there's 2 negotiation arenas interact is, I think, in first of all strengthening the domestic level capacities in implementing reforms and in implementing international agreements. And as you said, to some extent there are also some investment facilitation provisions and elements in the AFCFTA agreement. Obviously, it goes beyond just investment facilitation, but that's one element, so that can be strengthened. This overlaps. I think that there's an interesting case of learning, of mutual learning. So I guess it could be interesting to establish policy dialogues between the WTO members, the committee, and the institutional arrangements on the AFCFTA side. Let me make a small break and think about it. Oh, I'm sorry, but yeah, these are the key overlaps, the key elements where I see that there are synergies to use in order to promote both agreements. And obviously, if you think about technical assistance or capacity building activities, both for the AFCFTA and for the IFD agreement, it only makes sense to combine them to a certain extent, right? Because international agreements interact. There are overlaps, there are synergies, but there are also trade-offs. And it also only makes sense to look at the whole international legal framework a country is confronted with or is party to, because then you may also have to take into consideration bilateral investment treaties, for example, and to understand how these elements, these international agreements, interact at the domestic level, and how a national government can best make use of these agreements in order to attract FDI, in order to attract the kind of FDI these countries like to attract. So that's also key, right? So I think there's a couple of synergies between the two processes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think you've listed a number of them. So policy dialogues, which goes to knowledge sharing, and just, knowledge exchanges, really, because the AFCFTA's investment protocol, interestingly, is actually focused on intra-African investment, largely, although there's some expansion of the mandates to include, foreign investment or investment from outside Africa. But the idea is that all of the reforms that ought to take place as a result of the protocol will affect both intra-African investment and then foreign investment into Africa. And I see the IFD almost as that continuation and connection, because the AFCFTA's protocol is focused on, intra-African investors, but then the IFD really is about global investors going into LDCs and other developing countries. So it's sort of like is the continuation of what the investment protocol will be doing. So it's like an expansion of the mandates. So the investment protocol doesn't even have to do that. It can just work with the IFD for the wider investment facilitation mandates. I think that that's very key. And even like you said, the expertise. So now in terms of some of these frameworks and guidelines, best practices for investment facilitation, just bringing those on board for the AFCFTA's process, or for the AFCFTA investment protocols process, just to, you were saying some things about a single window for submitting, documents and things like that may serve as useful guidelines even for the AFCFTA's process as they work with national IPAs or national investment promotion agencies to ease the facilitation of investment into the economies. So I think that that's very key. But then operationally, what do you think that may look like? And again, sorry to put you on the spot. So would you recommend, so for example, if tomorrow we wanted to, set up some of these conversations already, both instruments are being finalized, more or less, and then even to already start or initiate conversations about how they can collaborate more. You mentioned the Friends of Investment Facilitation for Development, so the fifth, I think you said.
Fifth, yeah.
Fifth, yes, and you said they're non-OECD countries, so presumably a number of them are AFCFTA state parties. So would it be having an initial policy dialogue, to discuss, both instruments, to highlight areas of intersection, and then to lay out maybe some plans for developing, advancing together, and working together? What do you think about that?
I think there's still space in order to promote such dialogues. I think the potential is there, but it has not yet been used. And that there may be a couple of countries which are in a good position in order to push something like that forward. I'm thinking of Nigeria, which was also instrumental in order to promote the investment facilitation agenda. And I think there are a couple of countries that can be really of help in order to see where the synergies lie, right? I'm more thinking about West African countries because typically they are also part of or they are more favorable with regard to the IFD agreement negotiations. Obviously, West Africa at the moment also has other challenges, obviously, but that's beyond the economic or the trade and investment area. But these are countries that can push forward such a collaborative approach. Obviously, there are also countries on the African continent which are very much opposed to IFD. But yeah, I think it's a process. It's a process of better understanding of what the IFD agreement is about and what it is not about. What kind of effects it can have, and yeah, what kind of domestic reforms you would need to undertake in order to implement and benefit from the IFD agreement. And in that process, I'm sure many countries or policymakers may learn that while implementing the IFD agreement, you can also benefit from these domestic reforms in vis-a-vis to the AFCFTA process. So I think there are a lot of synergies, in particular if you think about the kind of domestic reforms you would have to undertake. I think if you think these two processes together, you can really come up with an efficient and well-structured domestic investment framework, which avoid duplications, right? Which are not a good idea when it comes to policy making, and which is obviously not a good idea when it comes to trying to attract foreign investors, which are, would like to have streamlined and very predictable processes on the side of the domestic, or on the side of the host economy.
Thank you for that. We're wrapping up the interview, but then I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the countries that oppose the IFD. So it's the main reason because they think it's a coordinating instrument and they don't want to be coordinated by the WTO, or they don't want measures to be imposed on them by the WTO.
I think it's a mix of criticism. So on the one side, you have this very fundamental or principle-based hesitancy to use plurilateral approaches in order to negotiate WTO rules, right? And that's beyond investment or beyond e-commerce or whatever. It's just the arrangement of a smaller group of countries going forward. And then obviously there's also a discussion or a fear that an IFD agreement may reduce policy space. Policy space in order to promote domestic reforms, workforce reforms, or even economic or ecological reforms. Here I would respond, please take a look at the text, which is not published officially, you have to admit, but there are leaks. You can get a pretty good sense of what this agreement is about and what it's not about, and you will find very soft language, right? And in only with regard to a couple of provisions, you really have hard binding language, and it's basically about countries making use of this agreement very flexibly. So I wouldn't be too concerned about policy space issues. And then obviously there are also some critics which I say, okay, now we are negotiating an investment facilitation agreement, but that may be the first step in order to negotiate a multilateral investment protection or investment liberalization agreement. I mean, I understand that this was the fear 20 years ago when a number of countries walked out of the negotiation room in Cancun, when WTO members negotiated the so-called Singapore issues, where investment was part of these issues. But we should not forget the countries which walked out of the room in Cancun 20 years ago are the same, more or less the same countries which are today negotiating the IFD agreement, right? So China, Brazil, etc. So I would, and these countries are making it very explicitly that this agreement is not about protection, liberalization, or ISDS. So, and I think that's a credible, that's a very credible position. So I wouldn't be too worried about such an expensive negotiation agenda. The problems are really practical. How can we use an international agreement at the domestic level in LDCs? How we can improve domestic frameworks for foreign investors, for African investors, but also for domestic investors? How can we improve these issues? And I guess that's an agenda which a country should worry about anyways. And here you have an international agreement, which is kind of a blueprint of what you can do. It's a basis for mutual learning. It's a basis for attracting additional technical assistance, capacity building. So I would hope that with such an informed discussion, more countries would join the agreement and making best use of what kind of support is being offered.
Thank you very much for that, Axel. So, as you know, in lieu of final remarks, what would you say you're optimistic about as far as the investment landscape for LDCs, for developing countries, as far as that goes? Because we know that there's been a lot of talk about global fragmentation and even things about friendshoring, nearshoring. I mean, of course, the trade and investment wars between some geopolitical powers. But what are you optimistic about the future?
Well, I think what I'm optimistic about is that multilateralism still works, still seems to work, right? We have talked about the IFD agreement in the WTO sphere, but if I look to the to other areas of multilateralism, be it the governance of our oceans or the recent framework for biodiversity, in all those areas, you see that there's still interest in multilateralism, and I think that's very encouraging. And so I wouldn't be too worried about this discussion of a global fragmentation. Obviously, it's visible that we live in an era of a geopolitical, geoeconomic competition, where there's also a lot of issues related to trust, in particular between the global north, the global south, if you like to use these terms. But still, I think if you look at the practical level, when it comes to foreign investors, and when it comes also to domestic level economic policy making, I think these discussion about decoupling, de-risking, friendshoring, nearshoring, whatever term you would like to use, it's not felt that strongly on the practical level. I think that these are discourses. We have to take them seriously, but we also have I also see enough tendencies and processes where countries and actors are willing to move forward with a cooperative agenda. So that's perhaps a way to end this discussion on a positive note.
No positive notes. Thank you so much for this interview. Thank you for making yourself available for the interview. It's the Africa Policy Research Institute's expert interview with Axel Berger of EDOS. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much for the conversation, also from learning from you about the AFCFTA process. And yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you.